This is the lecture on Introduction to Auditing. We will be covering the auditing research aspects when we meet in the computer lab during the week. The first thing I'd like to talk about is what is an audit, and there's three diagrams on the handout if you're looking at that, and the most simple way to describe an audit is that it's a comparison between something, and it's very broad, and criteria that describes what that something should be doing. The auditor makes the comparison and then issues a report to describe the findings. So if I scroll down to the middle of the page, let's assume that the auditor is going to do an audit of financial statements. The auditor would compare the financial statements to generally accepted accounting principles and issue a report indicating whether or not the financial statements in all respects are fairly stated according to generally accepted accounting principles. Now, there's a lot of things in financial statements, so when the auditor does the work, we break it down by component. So there'll be somebody assigned to audit cash, there'll be somebody assigned to audit receivables, there'll be somebody assigned to audit inventory, and so forth. So if the auditor was doing an audit of accounts receivable, if our criteria is GAAP, we would go to the codification 310, and in that part, that's where we find the accounting standards for receivables, make a comparison. If receivables are in compliance with GAAP, that would be indicated in the report. If the receivables were not in compliance with GAAP, the deviation would be noted. So the important thing to remember is that auditors always have to have some type of criteria in order to make an evaluation. The next idea I'd like to point out starts on the bottom of page 1 and continues on to page 2. There's many different kinds of audits, and what I'm asking you to do is to be able to identify what each of these types of audits are. So the first type of audit I'm mentioning is called an external audit, and this is an audit that must be done by a CPA. The CPA is hired to give an opinion on financial statements, and the reason that a company uses an independent CPA rather than an employee is so that the users of the audit report could have more faith in it. Think about it this way. If management tells you the financial statements are okay, you might believe them, but you also know that as employees of the company, they have motivation to make it look good. So by having an outside party come in to do the audit, we have more faith in the results. I'm going to make the screen a little more centered here. The second type of audit that I'm going to mention is called an internal audit, and these are individuals that are employees of the company. In a best case situation, they don't work for management. They actually work for the people who are ultimately responsible for the company, the board of directors, and that gives them a little more authority to look around. And their work can include financial statements, but it's much, much broader. So for example, it wouldn't be unusual for an internal auditor to look at a computer network. And how are you going to know if a computer network is doing what it's supposed to be doing? Well, there's various guidelines that relate to internal controls, and the auditor could compare the network to those internal control guidelines. An internal auditor might also look at new employees. What might the internal auditor be interested in? Well, the company may have hiring practices and policies, or there's laws related to hiring practices and policies. And so the auditor would compare how new employees were handled to those hiring practices and policies, and either report the employees were handled okay, or report that there were deviations. Another example would be the Internal Revenue Service. There's all kinds of laws related to what people must pay in tax, when they must pay tax, what their filing responsibilities are. And so, for example, an auditor for the Internal Revenue Service might take what's on a tax return and compare it to the Internal Revenue Code, which describes the laws related to what somebody owes for tax. And the last one I'm going to mention is GAO. The GAO is a government organization called the Government Accountability Office. And if I click on the link here for About, it says that they are often called the Congressional Watchdog. So they investigate how the federal government spends its tax dollars. They look into all sorts of things, not just financial statements. You know, it could be as interesting as whether or not a national park has the appropriate safety features to keep the visitors to the park safe from problems that could occur. So many different ways that audits are done. They could be independent outside people, employees, government agencies. Those are just a few examples of what auditors can do. So are audits required, right? That's the next question to think about. If you are working for a public company and that public company files with the SEC or is listed on a stock exchange, then the financial statements of that company must be audited annually by a CPA. So by law, CPAs are the only persons allowed to do audits of financial statements. So I hope this gives you some idea as to why our accounting program is pretty crowded with requirements. We want to make sure that our students meet the requirements to sit for the CPA exam if that's what they're interested in. If you are a public company and your stock is listed on a major exchange, major exchanges examples would be the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ Stock Exchange. One of the requirements of being listed on that exchange is that you have an internal audit department. So in many large companies, it's very, very common to see internal audit departments. So what about private companies, right? They're not necessarily filing with the SEC. They're not necessarily listed on stock exchanges, but they maybe do business with some third parties, such as a bank that has lent them money, or a creditor that's going to provide them with supplies, or maybe they have a fair number of stockholders who are just interested in getting assurance as to what's going on at the company. So it's also not unusual for private companies to also have audits done. So the next point on the bottom of page 2 is what governs the process of an audit. So depending upon the type of audit that you're doing, there are standards that describe what should be done. If you are performing an internal audit, you would most likely go to the Institute of Internal Auditors. They are that is not what I wanted to happen. This looks better. There we go. We will most likely go to the Institute of Internal Auditors, who have audit standards that are designed to handle what is done by employees of their company. So internal auditors aren't really regulated by any government agency like CPAs are. Membership in the Institute of Internal Auditors is voluntary, and really the only people that would have to follow them are members of the Institute of Internal Auditors. But their work is considered best practices, so it would be pretty unusual for a medium or large size internal audit department to do something other than follow IIA standards. And if you look on the screen here, you can see that the IIA has a large number of languages that it uses to publish its standards. It's a international organization, and they make sure that they handle everything that their members need. If you're conducting an audit of financial statements for a non-public company, the American Institute of CPAs is the organization that issues those standards. These are called Statements on Auditing Standards, and you can see that they're consecutively numbered, and we're up to number 121, so that tells you there's quite a few of those. And again, these govern audits of financial statements for companies that are not public. We'll be looking at those when we get into the computer lab. The third set of standards that's listed here deals with audits of financial statements for companies that are publicly traded. So the organization that issues that is called the PCAOB, and they were created by Congress in 2002 to provide oversight over the audit of financial statements of public companies. So some of their standards are like the AICPA, some of their standards are unique. And if you're engaged in audits outside of the U.S., you're most likely going to use international auditing standards. There's another organization that issues those, and once again you'd see some overlap with what we have in the U.S., and as the U.S. rewrites standards, they always look to see whether or not they can be harmonized with international standards. So if you were to dive into those standards and look at different parts, what would you see? All of them talk about skills, competencies, and qualities of an auditor. So for example, not anyone can do an audit. If you in some way have a connection to the organization being audited, you're not independent, there's a chance you could be biased. And so these standards would say that the lack of independence causes a problem. If you are not competent in the area of auditing or the area of criteria that's being looked at, those standards would say that you need to get some education and training before you do that audit. They also talk about how to plan the audit. And generally in auditing, we don't treat everything equally. In some cases, or in most cases, there's situations where what we're looking at may have a higher risk of not complying with the criteria that we're evaluating. Or the size of something may be very large, and because of its size, we want to make sure that it's in compliance. And so those types of situations would get higher priority in the audit. Once we've decided on our plan and what we're going to look at, we also then need to have some idea on how to execute the audit. And so the auditing standards talk about what kind of evidence could be obtained to show activities comply with the criteria. It talks about how you would document the fact that you did your work. It also stresses that it's important to have individuals who are experienced in auditing review the work that is done to make sure that it was done in accordance with standards, to make sure that the findings are supported by the work. And when we're done with our audit, right, the last step is to report it. And so these standards talk about what kind of report would you issue if no problems are found, what kind of report would you issue if problems were detected. So this brings us back to our little model as to what an auditor might do, right? There's a need to compare something to a criteria and issue a report. So one type of research, right, would first of all be how to conduct an audit. And that could involve the standards, but also what a lot of auditors do is they look for something called an audit program. So once you've made a decision about how to audit something, it's not unusual for the auditor to write up a list of steps that would be followed. The list can be given to an assistant auditor who's less experienced, and that gives that auditor some guidance as to what to do. Besides looking at the Institute of Internal Auditors website, the AICPA website, there's some people who have made a living on just helping auditors find audit programs. So this AuditNet is kind of an interesting organization. It was started by a guy who just thought it would be useful to have a place where auditors can go to share programs. And so you can see, if we look here, that there's 247 pages of audit programs. The premium ones are by subscription. The basic ones are for free. And they're arranged alphabetically, or you can use the search box. But often, just knowing where to go to find an audit program, the list of steps that should be followed is very useful in planning. Another resource is called Knowledge Leader. This is a for-profit organization, and they make a lot of things available to internal audit departments. One of those being, you can see the link here for audit programs. So besides doing research on how to conduct the audit, our auditor would also have to do some research to understand what is being audited. So I have listed here some very different industries, right? Casino, hotel, or bank, right? If you were to audit a casino, they make their money through running gambling games, right? Blackjack and poker and slot machines and all sorts of stuff. So do you understand how that organization works? A hotel, right, makes its operations by not only renting rooms, but by selling food and beverage services, by providing banquet facilities. Do you understand all those things about a hotel? A bank makes its money, right, by acquiring deposits and lending the money out or making investments. So that's a much different kind of industry also. And if you don't understand how something operates, it's going to be difficult to make some type of evaluation. So the final thing then, right, that an auditor might need to do research on would also be for what kind of criteria is appropriate to use. So for example, taxes is often an easy one. We know that transactions need to be done in accordance with the law. Sometimes the law is decided by Congress and written into laws. Sometimes the law is not written but decided by cases, and so somebody involved in tax practice would have to know how to look those things up. So if you've noticed, right on the top of each heading, when we get to the quiz on Tuesday or Thursday, there'll be one or two questions on each of these topics that I've talked about. And I think the questions I have listed above come to 9. So for a final question, current events at Bradley, what is the name of the new Bradley president? Or alternative question, when did he graduate from Bradley? So that finishes the lecture on Intro to Auditing. I've tried to provide some background on the auditing process. When we get in the computer lab and start using the computers, we'll do some examples of audit research. I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday or Thursday.